Our guest this week is Patrick Emek, commentator on insurgency. With Patrick, we'll discuss Afghanistan, ISIS, and the Philippines. Our guest today is Patrick Emek. Patrick is a writer, he's an analyst really on world affairs. He's worked on issues as disparate as the Philippines and Indonesia. He covers counterinsurgency, insurgency, the problems of uprisings in the world and their meaning for us. Before we start our discussion, which is going to focus, of course, on the Philippines, on the issue of Afghanistan, very close to our heart, and on the issue of Iraq and ISIS. We're going to watch a short video package, and then we'll move into our talk. The Philippine government has been plagued by conflicts based on political issues conducted by rebel organizations. Most terrorism in the country is conducted by groups based in the south of this island nation that are Muslim in character and resent rule from the Christian dominant north. Now that a tumultuous decade of military intervention has ended and a new government is taking over in Afghanistan, many in the international community appear eager to forget about the country and leave Afghans to handle their myriad problems alone. It is not just Western combat troops who are withdrawing. UN and embassy personnel are also leaving in significant numbers. In its rush to see the country stand on its own 2 feet, the international community risks cutting critical funding and support to Afghanistan too soon and too far, leaving millions of the most vulnerable Afghans behind. The battle between ISIS on the one hand and Iraqi security forces and the Kurds on the other has been raging for some considerable time. The US-led coalition began launching airstrikes against ISIS back in August of last year and has halted but not driven back the massive territorial advance by the group in Iraq. Iran has also brought its forces into play in support of the Iraq army in a so far unsuccessful attempt to curb the power of ISIS. So Patrick, the Philippines, I mean, really an area we all love but know too little about. Explain a little the insurgency that emerged there. What were the causes of that?
William, thanks very much for having me on your program. It's great to be here today with yourself and your wonderful audience. The problems in the Philippines go back to colonialization. The Philippines was colonized by the Spanish. Then it was under American administration for a period of time. When it came out of American administration in the 1940s, there was an issue whether the Muslim South should be granted autonomy. But the mainly Christian government in Manila did not want that, and it persuaded American senators that it would not be in the interests of long-term unity. So the genesis goes back to the time the Philippines became independent of America, but the actual origins of conflict go way back to before the Spanish arrived, when in fact the Philippines was a Muslim sultanate. It was part of a huge sultanate which spanned most of the islands and indeed incorporated Sabah, Malaysia as well.
Really? I have no idea. Shows how grossly ignorant I am of history. That is staggering. And so this developed into an insurgency. really comparatively recently?
It was, to put it in a nutshell for your audience, the Muslim people in the Philippines were discriminated against for hundreds of years. Their rights were taken away, their land was taken away, and one of the main causes for the insurgency were and are still today land rights. Today it's more complicated because the insurgents are talking about absolute land rights. That means the minerals underneath the soil as opposed to just tilling the soil, and that is the issue which is complicating a long-term peace in the Philippines. There was a lot of I would say a great ceremony in Manila not too long ago this year, when a final permanent peace was announced in the southern Philippines. Sadly, I have to tell your listeners that is not the case, because the issue of land rights has still not finally been negotiated. And until it is, there will be no peace in the southern Philippines, despite what the Philippines government might actually say.
And I mean, we're talking about resources here. Are there oil resources?
There's oil, there are oil, uranium, many other strategic minerals in the area of the southern Philippines, in vast quantities. In fact, a lot of research has taken place by a number of major companies, and they estimate I believe it's the cubic feet to be very, very substantial, possibly in the trillions in some potential fields. What is hindering exploration is conflict, not just conflict, but there is piracy in the areas as well. There's clan warfare. I was very fortunate to be co-opted by the then, I believe, Director of Agriculture and Fisheries, Professor Sankula Tindik. I believe he's now a senior government administrator in the southern Philippines. I was very fortunate to be co-opted as a member of his scientific team. So I had an opportunity, a unique opportunity, to visit many of the islands in the which straddle the southern Philippines, almost all the way to Sitankay.
I mean, what is the Muslim? Do you have any idea? I don't suppose there have been any proper censuses that tell us what proportion of the Philippines population is Muslim as opposed to Christian?
The proportion is actually quite small. The majority of the population in the Philippines, by majority I mean over 70%, are Christian. So, and the Muslim population tends to be concentrated in the southern areas and in the islands in the Sulu Seas. So Muslims would argue that there's been a deliberate policy of plantation of the government in Manila encouraging Christian settlers to go south, to take their lands and then to issue title. And it's not an uncommon issue in where you have colonization in many other parts of the world.
Yes,
well, not only there. We'll get to that in a minute. So there are real, genuine grievances, but the most important one is the issue of land rights.
And the
can I just say, at one stage the Sultanate stretched all the way to Manila, and during the Second World War, when the Japanese invaded Manila, they went obviously for the municipal buildings, and they got all the maps, and they blocked off all the main roads. What they did not get hold of were the old roads built by the Sultanate, and that was where the partisans managed to get in and out of Manila and help the American forces, because when the Christians came into office in the municipalities, they threw out all the old maps of all the old roads. So it was by the old roads and the by roads that the partisans, struggling against the Japanese and supporting the Allies, were able to get the upper hand and were able to sneak supplies in and out of Manila during the war.
So what are the, I mean, you say the insurgency has not gone away, yet it is more peaceful than it was?
Well, if you listen to the government of the Philippines, yes, it is more peaceful, and peace is being restored. My concern is that the most recent peace settlement has brought in quite a few players from Europe and a number from the United Kingdom, to such an extent that they are almost underpinning peace in the southern Philippines. So if conflict does break out in the future, it could involve the presence of Western forces or indeed paramilitary forces or perhaps even contractors to a greater extent than has ever been present before.
And I mean, you say if conflict breaks out, you're
major conflict.
Yes, I mean in the past we have seen major conflict, haven't we? We have seen a very substantial.
Yes, indeed. And I met, when I was traversing the islands, I met individuals who were affiliated to Al-Qaeda and were affiliated to other foreign organizations. And indeed, I was struck by the number of mosques and how the people who were impoverished and were denied rights seemed to be turning more and more to religion and to more and more external extreme influences of religion.
Because Al-Qaeda would have nothing to do with the Philippines, really. It's in essence, it's a completely, well, it's an Arab organization, but it has some resonance there.
Most certainly it did. And the reason it did was because the people of the southern Philippines are also Muslims, and there is this concept of the Ummah, and it's taken to an extreme level, which it can be sometimes. It means that extremists, particularly Salafists and Wahhabists, want to incorporate Muslim societies into their brand of ideology worldwide. And they want to subsume them to a particular version of Islam, which is totally alien to local conditions.
So you would view this as actually happening, that Salafists are influencing the people of
I've absolutely no doubt. I've seen it in many countries I've visited. Unfortunately, what's actually happened over a period of time is that a particular country, which has now been recognized by the United States and is indeed is a good friend of the West, has been exporting extremism and extremist clerics to many parts of the world, and these clerics have been changing the Islamic perception of what were relatively moderate people with localized ideals and saying, no, you have to join us in this worldwide crusade. And the reason why you have a problem is that you've turned away from true Islam, and our version will bring you back. And it's only when you understand our brand of Islam that you can begin to make progress.
So let's, I mean, you're referring now to the wider scene.
Unfortunately, Philippines doesn't exist in a vacuum, so
yes,
I have to bring in other players.
Yes, yes. Well, perhaps, well, let's talk a bit about the other subjects on our agenda. Iraq, Afghanistan. Let's start with Afghanistan. Where are we? We're leaving it, have left Afghanistan, for goodness sake. We're no longer there. The Taliban are showing their faces again and beginning to become a factor. How do you view, well, first of all, how do you view what we have done in Afghanistan? Let's talk about the...
I'd like to go back more than 10 years ago when I was speaking with a serving British officer, and we were discussing Afghanistan, and I said, you know, someday it'll be like the Romans leaving Britain to be called back to deal with problems overseas. They'll be leaving at the dead of midnight. And he was very polite, and we had a polite conversation, but I'm very, very struck. My own personal feeling is that our leaving Afghanistan is a betrayal of the Afghan people before the job has been done. There are many people who believe that, in fact, I was reading not too long ago and had discussions here in London with one of the major tribal leaders, Ajmal Khan, a very influential, very influential. He is someone who, obviously, he's a devout Muslim. He understands the tribal nature of Afghanistan. He understands that Afghanistan has to take its true place in the world. He understands that the rights of women must be enshrined in any Muslim society. His values are Muslim values, but looking not just now, but looking into the future. And I was very impressed when I met him in London, and indeed he's been in many capitals. I believe he, not too long ago, met with Mr. Brzezinski in the United States, and I'm not quite sure whether he met with Madeleine Albright.
But I mean, in a way, what we want to hear is what you think. But
well, I think my view is that he would make a brilliant leader, a brilliant president.
He's one of the paramount chiefs, of course, of which Afghanistan has.
Do you know? I'm not sure if you know, William, that he can attract 100,000 people at a meeting.
Well,
he's almost. Not only that, the man understands that one of the fundamental problems in Afghanistan is corruption, and I've no doubt that he would, as a leader, ensure that would be minimized.
Well, we would hope that people of his caliber
people
come
of
forward.
his caliber, yes, indeed.
But I mean, Ajmal, who is certainly a force to be reckoned with, and we would hope to interview him at some point on ANN himself. But he is one of the, if you like, the young Turks of Afghanistan who are emerging on the scene.
One of the young visionary Turks.
Well, exactly. But these people are coming. Because, and you're saying that we didn't do the job in Afghanistan,
no,
but on the other hand, you look at many of these conflicts, historically, I mean, the Americans had to leave Vietnam, and I'm an Anglo-American. They felt, many of them felt, that they would have wished to stay in, but they couldn't. In a sense, we have been driven out, haven't we? We have failed, we have had to leave.
Well, if you're putting it into that perspective, I need to relate to an article I read by Jack Devine. I believe he was the Deputy Director of CIA Operations, and Whitney Casal. His main argument was that a deal would have to be done with Pakistan. It was inevitable that a deal would have to be done. And at that time he was talking against the grain. Now people can actually see, people who read his article, and I believe quite a number of people did, that it would be a mistake to completely abandon Afghanistan. That indeed, not only does Afghanistan need assistance in developing as a modern society, not just financial assistance, but infrastructural assistance, but also we need to be looking at its neighbour, which also has a very concerned interest, which is Pakistan.
Pakistan and India, in a sense, are fighting a proxy war in Afghanistan.
They are, as you
and
know.
indeed, Pakistan's ISI, the State Intelligence Organization, has been very keen on keeping good relationships with the Taliban. And of course, if you look at it, there's a logic to that. There's double logic to that. At one level, the Pashtun, or the Pashto people, spread right across Pakistan and Afghanistan, and many Pakistanis will call themselves Pashto, who come from that particular region first, and even call themselves Afghan first, rather than Pakistani. So they have a real, genuine interest. Plus, they have the fear of India, and they don't want to see a Kabul government as an ally of India, so that they are somehow isolated between two enemies.
Well, I think also a future government in Afghanistan is very wary of getting too involved with Pakistan because of for the very reasons you've just mentioned, and indeed is keeping its options open, as is India, and is developing cordial relations with India, which indeed should be the case, because I think our purpose must be to promote regional stability and not factionalism and tribalism and division. And just on another point, I'm sure you're aware that the Afghan national anthem refers to 14 of the tribes. So it's not just one tribe, the Pashtuns.
No, of course, no. The Pashto caused most of the trouble.
Yes. But the national and indeed, I believe more than 70% of Afghans, if asked, do you consider yourself a member of a tribe or Afghani or Afghan, they would say that they are Afghan or Afghani first. I'm not quite sure which is the best terminology.
But
Afghan,
Afghan, because Afghani
is the currency.
Yes, you get a lot of trouble.
Yes, I was told that.
Oh, yes.
Yes. But they would put their nation before their tribe. And indeed, I feel that this is something that's emerging now. As we look at the chaos in North Africa, the chaos in Iraq, at the root of it is tribalism. We could look at many parts of Africa.
Do you see then, before we do,
yes.
we will talk about Iraq very shortly, but before we do, we have now a new government, a kind of, I don't know, what would you call it, a government of national unity with a president and a chief executive. Chief executive sounds like a businessman, and I'm not sure how much influence Abdullah is going to have over this new government, but are you encouraged by?
At the moment, I am quite encouraged. However, what I would say is that one has to always be aware that Afghanistan is a tribal nation. You must bring the tribes on board. You cannot parachute democracy and parachute McDonald's or Pizza Hut into a country which has traditions going back hundreds of years. You have to take a country like that gradually into the future with people of vision and the leadership.
Because many would feel that the future for Afghanistan is to see Afghanistan partitioned between north and south. The Taliban taking control of the north, and the Abdullah's Northern Alliance types and various warlords taking control. Taliban taking control of the south, Abdullah and the Northern Alliance warlords taking control of the north. They see this partition of Afghanistan as an inevitable consequence of our having left, and that basically we wasted our time going in there in the first place.
I don't believe that's the case. I'm more of an optimist than you are, William. I can see why people would say that, because this appears to be how the lines of division are panning out. But believe me, from what I know, the Afghan people do not want this type of scenario. They want to be united as a country and as a people. They don't want to be factionalized. And there is another issue here. It's like saying, well, look, just give part of Iraq to ISIS and the problem will be over. The problem will not be over if the Taliban are left in control of an area. Believe me, there may be a hiatus before the insurgency will begin again. Quite simply because one has to look at the philosophy which is backing up Talibanization or backing up an Iraqi caliphate. And when one understands the philosophy, one understands that there is no compromise with modernism, that books are bad, that women being educated is evil, that images of Muslim saints is the work of Satan, that
yes, a sort of Salafist takfiri Salafist approach, which rejects everything. But I mean, it is a force in the Middle East today.
Even William, the Hadith, committing the Hadith to paper is regarded as the work of Satan by extremists, by the Islamic Caliphate, and by the Taliban. So all of these, when one actually begins to appreciate where ISIS is, what its perception and vision of the world is, and the Taliban, one can see that there's no compromise with the type of society we live in.
But before we move on, we will move on now, but before we do, I mean, Ashraf Ghani, the new president of Afghanistan, is in some respects a visionary. He does seem to have a good heart. There is, you would agree, some hope for this man.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think he needs us to be more supportive. He needs people in the UK and in Washington to actually be vocally supportive, not just be vocally, but to be prepared to give him the time and give him the resources to accomplish what he's trying to do.
Okay, now to the most well, what can we say, the most sensitive, the most powerful, the most important issue on our plate, because it's the issue of this moment, the issue of Iraq, ISIS, the whole emerging scene. ISIS, as you rightly point out, is a Takfiri group, a rejectionist group. Perhaps a little about that to open our discussion.
I'd like to go back to what I said. You have the Quran and the Hadith, which are sacred to Muslims. As far as ISIS is concerned, anyone who commits the Hadith to paper is a Satanist. That is completely alien to the thinking, I would say, of 99% in the Muslim world. That's 1.6 billion Muslims. It's a completely alien concept. So we're looking at not just a rejectionist and a revisionist, but we're looking at a medievalist, and I call them a sect. I don't even call them a movement. I call them a sect, which wants to take its people back to an era of godliness, which in fact never existed in the vision that they have. But it's very difficult, as you know, to defeat an ideology. One can make compromises where there are political objectives, but where the objective is Allah, or where the objective is God, or Yahweh, then it becomes very, very difficult to tackle these sort of problems. But I'd like to take the main core of what you're asking. My own personal opinion is that, and I have to say this, all of the problems of Iraq go back to Paul Bremer when he was proconsul. He certainly got it wrong, got it disastrously wrong. He created a situation where the Sunnis were marginalized, where in fact, I've said on one of my blogs, because I have a blog site, I said that they were they almost felt as if they were being spat on by people, and he allowed and encouraged this. He fired people with knowledge, with intimate knowledge of the workings of Iraq, right, left and center. He didn't just fire them, but he dehumanized them, demoralized them, told them that they were nothing. So I think that the problems of today go back to that.
Well, you're really referring, I mean, Paul Bremer did two things, which I think you're talking of. One was to send the Iraq army home, the entire Iraq army. The other
ridiculous.
Was to introduce the debathification laws, which obviously are in place to this day, and indeed are stronger now than they were under Bremer. But Bremer kicked out the idea that was on the cards for a Truth and Reconciliation type approach, committee approach, like had been, or something along the lines of that had been practiced in South Africa.
Let's look at Argentina, let's look at South Africa, let's look at many countries, Colombia, where Truth and Reconciliation, and Northern Ireland has been the way forward. Have they failed? No, indeed they have not. What actually happened, and I feel very embarrassed to say this, is that in Washington these days there are people who either don't understand foreign policy or simply don't understand the way the real world is working.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true.
I feel very ashamed to say that, because many of my good colleagues and mentors were Americans with a wonderful perception of the world. But the type of people, the type of animals, in inverted commas, who are getting into politics now seem to be quite an ignorant
It's interesting because a kind of, your feeling is that we are in some rather catastrophic situation, but is there a way forward? Is there a way out?
There's always a way out. If you have vision, you can always find a way out in politics. What we really need, in Washington in particular, are people who have a sense of vision, who have a sense of understanding, who understand human needs, who understand the need for people to have jobs.
So the current policy, the policy of bombing ISIS is counterproductive as it stands?
The policy of bombing ISIS, I would say, is counterproductive if the Gulf states are not taking the lead role. I feel that, or I think, I know that the involvement of Iran, and indeed the involvement of other nations, could well be seen for the Sunni communities in the Gulf to be counterproductive. However, to defeat an extremist organization like ISIS, a number of issues need to be addressed. First are the grievances of the Sunnis in Iraq.
Yeah,
no doubt about that. You have to get to the core of it, because they are providing the backbone of support for ISIS.
Yes, I think the seminal thing to be done is the repeal of those debathification laws.
Absolutely. They were a total disaster. Yeah. But there's been one disaster after another coming from Washington. And again, it goes back to the type of people who are now recruited into the State Department, and the type of people that corporate America wants to see projecting the image of America. They are people who are well connected, but do not seem to have an intimate understanding of parts of the world they are assigned to. I could talk about India and its former ambassador there, but we won't go there today.
But basically, if you think that if there's a shift in mindset, and that there are actions beyond merely bombing, that we can deal with the ISIS problem. This is what you're saying.
That is one aspect. However, I do feel that with a movement like ISIS, it's not just a matter of containment. I think that countries have to be united and determined that they will end the issue of an ISIS caliphate completely. And for that, I feel that it's critical to have all of the players in the region being prepared to work together against a common enemy, like we were prepared to work with, you might say, people we didn't agree with, when the Nazis invaded Poland.
Nations like Turkey that are virtually de facto supporting ISIS for their own reasons. And you have vast support for ISIS in the Gulf as a whole, not necessarily from the governments, but from elements of the population who feel great sympathy for the concept of Arab renewal. So we are battling quite a major tide.
Well, I'd like to deal with these two issues separately. Turkey has its own ambitions with regard to Syria, and has its own vision of an extended Ottoman area. So we won't go too much into this, perhaps because of time, but so Turkey has a number of motives why it wants to get rid of President Assad, and indeed encouraging ISIS is simply one more tool in the kit to use for that. With regard to the Gulf states and their support, I compare their support of ISIS to American misinterpretation of key issues of state in the State Department. It's a misperception that by supporting ISIS they can at some point simply marginalize them, call them terrorists and drive them away. I don't think that will happen. I think their continued support of ISIS, one can actually see by what's happening in the Yemen, means that the problem will simply overflow and will engulf their principalities as well, their emirates, their kingdoms, and ultimately it will cause chaos, because we are talking about a perception of the world which is so different from that of moving forward that there can be no compromise, and they will certainly not be able to marginalize these groups once they consolidate themselves into functional states.
Patrick, thank you for those strong words of warning, and thank you too for being our guest on ANN. We have actually not quite finished, because there's one more thing we need to do, which is to discuss a book. But
thank you very much for having me on ANN. Very great to be here.
Okay, so Patrick, now we have a book, and it's a book by Patrick Emek, The Philippines, A Different Reality. This book, available on Amazon, is written by you about the very conflict we started discussing at the outset. What is your argument in this book?
I called it A Different Reality because I love the Philippines. I love the people of the Philippines. They're hard-working, wonderful people. But in my discussions in Manila and other places, I felt they were living in a different world when I talked about the south of their country. So that's where the title came from. We weren't talking about the same country. It seems like in schools in the Philippines, not even children are taught their own history properly. They're not honestly taught that they have a Muslim history that indeed they should be proud of. They're taught that they only have a Christian perspective. So I felt that there were two worlds that I was encountering. So hence the title, The Philippines, A Different Reality. So what I focus on is the reality of people who are marginalized rather than the 99.9% view that I was getting in Manila, that everything was okay and that, you know, there was no problem, and that people, when I mentioned the southern Philippines and the Muslim population there, people didn't seem to know anything. This was while I was researching the book.
Powerful. And I mean, I clearly knew nothing. I knew nothing of the Sultan and
the Sultanate. Yes, it's Brunei is involved as well in this wonderful Sultanate, and there's a wonderful history between the relationship between the Sultan of Brunei and the Sultan of Sulu. Wonderful history, a wonderful history which has been denied to the people of the Philippines because the government, I think, in post-American administration and even today feels too threatened to incorporate and be proud of a Muslim heritage existing since the pre-colonial times. Indeed, it was the Muslim Sultanate which developed all of the key roads leading all the way from the south, well, what key roads there could, of course, the Philippines is thousands of islands, into and out of Manila.
Well, bless you. Thank you so much, Patrick. So, The Philippines, A Different Reality by Patrick Emek, available on Amazon. It's actually published by Mandela Books.
Mandala 2 projects.
Yeah. Really grateful to you for bringing this to our attention. Grateful to you for being our guest on ANN Television.
Again, William, thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Thank you.